Yeah, looking forward to our conversation. I got Brian from NCU ISAO here today. Brian, I'll let you introduce yourself here in a minute, but we're going to do a fireside chat, kind of the state of cybersecurity at credit unions. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics from um, what's he's hearing from his organization and community of credit union security leaders and CEOs. We're talking about some compliance stuff, AI, and all sorts of fun stuff, threat landscape and beyond. We'd love to hear your questions. So if you have questions, please throw them in the chat or the Q&A. I'll be monitoring those today, integrating them throughout our conversation. And yeah, we'd love to make this a back and forth conversation. See, Ryan and I can talk for a couple hours, but it'll be way more interesting if you all throw in some questions in the chat or Q&A as relevant topics come up. So, and this will also be recorded as well. And if you want to share with your team afterwards, or can't stay for the whole hour, we'll send it out afterwards from there. So yeah, let's jump right in, Brian. Brian, would you
Sure.
mind, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us kind of your journey in the credit union space and what led you to form the NCU ISAO.
Yeah, thanks. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to hear me kind of go back and forth with the Rivial team here. And again, thank you for the opportunity. I see several of our members in the audience. As Taylor mentioned, we could go back and forth for hours. I think most of you know I could probably do this thing for an hour easily myself. So I'll try to be a little bit more succinct than is typical. But yeah, I'm Brian Hinze. I'm President CEO of NCU-ISAO. NCU-ISAO was formed a decade ago, actually. June 3rd is our 10th birthday, if you can believe that. And for those like
That's
kind of original members, it's kind of flown by. But, frankly, I'm not technically a founder of the organization. I came on right after it was founded on paper. So it was sort of a series of events that led me to this industry. I was in a completely different industry a decade ago. I had worked for a multinational company for 13 years. I went through a couple of global mergers and acquisitions with them, which was really interesting insight, and participated in our regional trade association, which was really like a trade association there to kind of promote our business interests and things like that. So I had nonprofit and trade association experience through that. At the end of my career there, I was running a small business division, which was a completely different division in branding, focused on smaller customers, regional versus kind of the big, massive customers that we had within our portfolio there. I was on the sales side, but also had multiple technical certifications. And I had no idea that that was going to feed into what we were going to be doing here at NCU-ISAO. In fact, for a couple of reasons, my wife and I chose to relocate at that time in 2016 from Tampa, Florida, where we had lived for 15 years at the time, across the country to Denver, Colorado, where we live now. And at that time, I kind of found myself looking for a new job. Her thing was all figured out through her company and the transfer that we had. And someone I had known for a very long time, Gene Fredrickson, who at the time was the CISO for PSCU, now known as Valera, and had an extensive cybersecurity career, had gotten with the founder of the Health ISAC. Now it was called it's just HISAC they go by, but the founder of the Health ISAC at the time. And there had been some federal legislation that was passed into the law about 6 months prior called the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. And that really all came together to allow this formation of ISAOs. Without going too deep into that part, it was really there to provide more support to private sector industry for information sharing and collaboration. Prior to that, it was all about the 16 segments of critical infrastructure as they were defined post 9/11 by the Department of Homeland Security. But there were several unrepresented sectors, subsectors, private industries that weren't part of that critical infrastructure. Of course, we work to support credit unions, but there's like a sports ISAO, faith-based ISAO. There's some state-level ISAOs out there that don't necessarily use the ISAO designation, but the whole point was this legislation that had been signed into law at the end of 2015 allowed for ISAOs to form. So Gene and Deb and some credit unions, CUSOs, all got together at Kennedy Space Center that summer. As luck would have it, I happened to be in that kind of initial meeting where they scoped out this unique opportunity to share information within the credit union space. And when I found myself looking for a job, they brought me in to create awareness of the organization, work with the inaugural steering committee. We called it the Leadership Advisory Board. Some wonderful stakeholders from the industry really helped open some doors and opportunities for me and NCU-ISAO. At that point, really, once we were ready to get started and kicked it off with our first ever annual conference in January of 2017 at Kennedy Space Center, we started really listening to those needs that credit unions have and focusing on how we could build this community into something that was truly valuable to them. So fast forward now, I got the big job, the big title, January of 2025. So it's been, I guess, about 16 months now, something like that, and really proud to be a part of this organization, one of the leaders of the organization. And you could say I'm a founder in the sense that I help build and shape it, but I couldn't have done it without a great group of stakeholders from the industry and from information sharing groups.
Thanks for the background, Brian. That's awesome. And congrats on the 10
Mhm.
years. And you could be a
Thank you.
founding employee, right? You could have, yeah. Super cool. Congrats on that. We really enjoyed partnering with you all over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And it's been a great synergies of our focus on supporting the credit union space. Very cool. And thanks very much. And I didn't know about that, the ISAO background. So super
Yeah.
fascinating. And I didn't know that whole arena and how those were all formed. So super interesting. Well, let's jump right into it. Once again, I see some more folks have joined on in. If you have questions as it relates to cybersecurity at credit unions, the whole gamut, and especially the threat landscape, right? Because I know that's where the NCUA ISAO really focuses. And I know Brian has a lot of interesting insights as he runs that organization. Throw them in the chat, right, or the Q&A. Happy to address them as we go through. Let's jump into our kind of our first topic, the state of the union.
Mhm.
What are you hearing from credit union security leaders, CEOs across the country
Mhm.
right now? And really, kind of what's keeping them up at night? What are kind of their top concerns?
Sure. I mean, it's not all AI, but it's a lot of AI, right? I mean, I think whether you go to sessions like this or you participate in industry conversations, I say the only thing even remotely right now giving AI a run for its money is probably crypto related, DeFi, that kind of stuff. But AI is really dominating the landscape for sure. I think for some of it, it's as basic as how to govern it, how to audit it, what AI tools and systems are we going to bring into the organization. And when we do, how do we keep track of who's using it? Are we using it safely? Those kind of things. There's also some organizations that are, telling me that they're trying to figure out how to scale up their teams. Not, like many industries, not everyone had native AI expertise when this big boom that started with Chat GPT and now it's evolved over the last few years. When this started, so how do you level up your team to bring in some expertise, and with that expertise, improve your tooling, improve how you're leveraging AI, not just for member facing products and services, but, to solve real problems within the organization. Those are definitely some of the big ones. And I would say that when we talk about the basics from the CISO side, the security leadership side, and should be on the top of mind for CEOs, I would definitely say if you haven't started with an AI acceptable use policy, then you definitely want to do that. There's an old saying that you can't really get mad at somebody for doing something that you couldn't tell them they couldn't do. And same should hold true with your employees. While you may feel like it's common sense not to go out to Chat GPT and upload a massive set of member data for analytics into the model, the public model. Now, if you haven't told someone they can't do that and that there's risks associated with it, then you should probably go to that kind of square one, which is acceptable use in AI governance. From there, the businesses are working to better track and audit and log, how AI systems are being used, how employees are using it, control whether it's Copilot or another third-party solution, control what can be uploaded into those systems, having visibility into which users did what. That kind of thing's really important. On the member side, of course, though, we're seeing a lot of adoption of AI tooling that, works to automate and increase availability of systems like, AI chatbots on the public facing site, as an example. But with that, obviously you want to make sure that that vendor is securing their code properly and that, they're not leaking other sensitive information that may be entered by a member out to some sort of third party service, things like that. Some organizations might have also identified, opportunities with agentic customer service agents, kind of the first touch point. So there's some of that too. And that's kind of a high level on what we're seeing with AI. Of course, agentic AI is, adapting that surface. I imagine we'll talk about that at different points throughout the talk here. But at a high level, that's kind of what we're seeing around AI. I'd also say whether it's because of the supervisory priorities being focused on fraud this year or not, one of the narratives that NCU-ISAO has had from the start, but we're seeing CISOs explain that this is something that they're trying to adopt at their organization, which is better collaboration between the information security and the fraud teams. Maybe add to that physical, especially with all the ATM jackpotting that took place last year, especially into the prior year a little bit. But, there's some security features, especially if you're managing your in-house ATM ATMs that I would make an easy argument for that convergence between physical, but at a minimum, bringing those cyber and fraud teams together, because so much fraud's perpetuated these days through digital channels that question of ownership might come into play. And with that is, potentially some structural setup that just natively your fraud team reports upstream to different leadership than information security, right? How do those teams better collaborate? How do they clearly define ownership of specific problems? So building that into the strategy moving forward and making sure that you're tackling fraud, which has a tangible, measurable result in fraud losses when you look at the P&L at the end of the day, right? So how do you reduce those fraud losses and how do you incorporate the security teams into that narrative, I think is really cool. In fact, I know of a couple credit unions in the Pacific Northwest at different time and place who've adapted this structurally. One was to roll security and fraud under the same VP who had traditionally had a security role. Another is just to, in the office, plop these people next to each other, their cubicles, so that they can, shout over the wall of the cubicle and say, hey, we're seeing this. Are you guys seeing this too? And so there's different ways to do it. And that strategy, of course, is up to the organization. But at the same time, certainly something that I think is worth addressing at your organization if you haven't really brought that up. And the other thing too is definitely how do we as an organization accelerate our time to patch? This is in current events being driven in many ways by Claude Mythos. If you haven't heard of Claude Mythos, this was something that was that is evidently such a powerful AI model that Anthropic came out with a program for IT security vendors, those big tech, basically to participate in Project Glasswing, identify all of their significant vulnerabilities before this AI was released at a larger scale to the public, because it was finding so many vulnerabilities in systems. And that is really built on a narrative that I do think already existed, which is how do organizations accelerate that time to patch? If you look at this patching imperative that is driven by not just AI's ability to find vulnerabilities, but to exploit them, right? Through agentic workflows or otherwise, then it's going to be really, really critical that you move and advance a quick time to patch. What that looks like, again, is going to be dependent on every organization. If that's where you want to point your battleship, again, is also up to every organization. But those are probably the three big ones, which is adopting, governing AI, as well as converging cyber and fraud teams to collaborate, and then accelerating vulnerability and patching time.
Super great, Brian. Thanks for covering all that. We got a bunch of awesome topics that I'd love to maybe double click on, and we can revisit as well. Folks, once again, as a reminder, if you want to have any questions for Brian on any of these topics and want to go a little bit deeper, throw your questions in the chat or Q&A. I did have one because we probably never have talked about it here at Rivial, at least not from my purview, or on any of our webinars, is crypto. I was curious if you had any just insights on that. I know I don't know how relevant it is to the audience, but just curious if you had anything on the threat landscape or even some practical insights on crypto and how to navigate that from a security standpoint.
I can tell you what the narrative is. And it kind of comes down into two schools of thought. There is one part of the narrative that for digital transformation, adoption of crypto, DeFi solutions, that these are the future, and that credit unions need to figure out ways to adopt these solutions, offer modern payments, flexible payments to really modernize the organization and draw the youthful crowd, those kinds of things into the environment. The second one is every time I hear about crypto, I hear about fraud, or I hear about wallets being raided, or I hear about things like ransomware gangs and these untraceable payments, or that the ledger's immutable, and immutable that might, fraud might lead to immutable losses, right? And how do we protect consumers from themselves when their online banking accounts are constantly under siege? How are we going to protect them with their digital wallets, right? And so it's really boiling down to two schools of thought there. I think like anything else, the reality falls between, and that's that, it is going to be in many cases the future, just like, AI is the future of technology in this regard. But on the flip side, if you really dig into where the fraud is taking place and what's happening, is it's the cryptocurrency exchanges and wherever identity can be compromised, where you're seeing a lot of this exploitation. It's not that the blockchain is being hacked, so to speak. It is more about there's a user interface at some level, and that's where most of this boils down to. So it is about securing the identity layer, which is really critical. I think with the volatility of cryptocurrency offerings, it's kind of interesting. And so, bring in obviously the federal legislation that was passed into law last year, the acts was it Clarity, Genius, things like that are offering new opportunities to adopt these. I know some great industry experts that I could put people in touch with that could talk about this all day and maybe even do a whole separate webinar for you guys. And I'll lean on them. But I will say when we just talk about the narrative, it's really those two things. How do we leverage this, take advantage of the future, adopt this versus, protect our members, protect the organization against fraud.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I know for especially if there's some community credit unions on the call, I know a big priority over the past couple of years has been like digital transformation, like you kind of mentioned earlier, right? How do we modernize our systems so that we can have more opportunities to serve our members? I was just curious, is there any pitfalls you've seen in that transformation? Obviously, if there was a larger credit union, they probably have most of the modern forms of payments and digital experiences. I was just curious, have you seen any like threat issues for community credit unions in that digital transformation? Maybe not so much crypto, but just in general as they kind of moved towards digital transformation. Totally cool if you haven't as well.
Mhm. I'd say the bulk of what we're seeing is still exploitation of systems that they're going to find they would call legacy, like online banking, things like that. I'm not suggesting that those other types, community banks and large financial institutions, that there aren't pitfalls there, but within the purview of kind of what we do every day, I'd say on the traditional fraud side, it's actually legacy stuff that continues to be exploited,
Hmm.
which, if anything, I would say in the exploit chain of that, if you look at traditional credentials and MFA that go into logging into online banking, you look at checks and mobile deposits, if anything, that future type of payments is actually on the exploit side through fintechs and then ultimately cashing out to cryptocurrency. So it's a kind of at the
Hmm.
end the tail of the fraud as they're trying to get that money to an untraceable, untrackable wallet, but using and abusing legitimate legacy systems or well-known systems and mature systems up front.
Thanks for sharing. Super interesting. Really cool. Well, there's a couple other topics I'd love to talk a little bit
Mhm.
more about. We talked about before we hit record or went live here. You were talking about identity. You had the phrase, attackers don't break in, they log in. I'd
Mhm.
love for you to kind of go a little bit deeper on that because obviously it relates to maybe some of these legacy systems or the identity side or even from the fraud side. Yeah, any thoughts there on kind of sharing as far as the threat landscape as it relates to identity?
100%. I could fill the rest of the session on that if I'm being
Cool.
honest with you. I'll break it down into two kind of major categories. One is modern phishing attacks and how those are being abused to compromise not just usernames and passwords, but authenticated session tokens. The second piece would be how information stealing malware, which some of you may or may not have heard of, info stealers. I've heard some people call them remote access Trojans. The modern term when on the credential side is info stealers, but how that disproportionately is impacting members out there and compromising accounts as well. So on the first side of that identity-based attack, I've heard a couple spins. I can't trace it back to certain vendors specifically in my mind, but I've heard it more than once in different places. And that's this like kind of phrase that modern attackers don't break in, they log in. And that's this sophisticated phishing infrastructure, which goes back a little farther than you'd think. But I'd say in the last couple of years, it's just been widely pervasive globally. And we call it adversary in the middle. My members on the call are going to be very familiar with this term. Unfortunately, it's something that we see kind of come in two phases, which is your traditional kind of broad, non-targeted mal spam or malicious spam with DocuSign lures and all these things. And sometimes they're well crafted, sometimes they're not on the front end. How convincing are they? Then there's the second piece, which we see spread pretty consistently in a few different campaigns a year across the credit union industry, which are really targeted, zeroed in. These are phishing emails that are coming from compromised email accounts from people you might know, and if nothing else, industry stakeholders, vendors, credit unions, oftentimes leadership in the credit unions. And ultimately, what happens, regardless of how we get to the end game, is there is some abuse of known Microsoft infrastructure. And I will say it can work on Google, iTunes, things like that, but they're very targeted in what we see from Microsoft because it's so widespread across the credit union space. So they're typically trying to abuse Microsoft credentials. And that essentially looks like a legitimate user account, which is what you have for the Microsoft side, and you have on the back end a legitimate Microsoft login workflow, right? Username, password, maybe you use the phishing resistant push authenticator from Microsoft Authenticator where it gives you the 2 digits and you just confirm what the 2 digits are, whatever that might be. But in the middle is attacker designed infrastructure which proxies that connection. The original version of this was called Evil Jinx, and then it turned into something called Evil Proxy. Now there's all these like commercialized kits out there with cool names. Everything's got to have a cool name in the cyber attack space, right? But anyway, essentially what this infrastructure does that sits in the middle is it captures the user credentials as they go through, but much more importantly is the authenticated session token. That session token, if you don't know what I'm talking about, is like when you close your browser and then you go back to the same website you were just at and you're still logged in. That's because there's a session token stored in the browser that's actually saying, yes, you're still allowed to be logged in under these certain conditions and things like that. And when that's stolen, they can replay that. And as long as that cookie or token is still valid, when they replay it, now they can get into your Microsoft accounts. They can download data from SharePoint, aka OneDrive. They can do all kinds of things and then spread that further. That is how identity-based attacks are really working to compromise modern businesses, modern industries, and the credit union to credit union or the credit union to known industry vendor attack has been super effective. We've been tracking it for 5 years. So effective, they really haven't changed their tactics, if I'm being honest. The initial lure is like exactly the same. It looks exactly the same as it used to. And so that's really scary. The way you beat that is aside from employee training and awareness, right? Look at the website. Are you logging in the real place? Why would you be asked for your Microsoft password to download a document from someone you don't know? There's that kind of common sense stuff. But in a sense of urgency or somebody that's multitasking, it's about adopting hardware-bound authentication. That's going to be your FIDO2. So that's everything from Windows Hello. So fingerprint biometrics built into Windows Hello, maybe cameras, but I think it takes a 4K camera to do video Windows Hello. Most of you aren't doing that in company devices. YubiKeys are probably the easiest to deploy. I know some of our members have not just deployed those to their staff, but they're using the NFC feature to access the building as well. So now you've got one device that can be your hardware-bound authentication for your computer, but also let you into the building, right? And then robust conditional access. And one of my favorites, because it's not hard for an attacker to log in from somewhere in the US, is not geographical based conditional access. It's compliant device. So if you're an Intune shop, and many of you might be nodding your heads, we use Intune, device compliance is a really effective conditional access control that if attackers logging in from a private server somewhere or a device that's not enrolled in Intune, it will block that login flow. So that's some actionable information on how you can work to prevent these attacks. In addition to that, I would say attacking the enterprise is going to be code flow attacks. These are kind of the flavor du jour. They abuse OAuth workflows in Microsoft, again, legitimate Microsoft infrastructure. There's no adversary in the middle here. This is your valid login account and valid Microsoft infrastructure. But what you have is the attacker has set up the valid infrastructure. They're going to look like these 9-character alphanumeric codes through a phishing site. And then once you enter that code in and then log in, you've authorized the OAuth connection the attacker set up. This is really important to just set up with conditional access. Learn.microsoft.com has a blocking code flow article. If you can't find that on Google, let me know and I'll send it to you. But that is something that I would highly recommend you implement. It is something that we are seeing fairly regularly since the end of February now, and something that is not going to be saved by FIDO because there is no attacker in the middle. It actually will, again, abuse the legitimate login workflows. But it's an easy conditional access policy to implement. And those are probably the biggest things on the identity side for enterprise. On the consumer side, while it can absolutely happen to enterprise, it's just less likely with all the controls that you have in place. And the enterprise-grade antivirus is going to be information stealing malware. This very sneaky malware, it's distributed through phishing attacks. It's distributed through drive-by type attacks on websites. One of the common ways is called click fix, where there's a little screen that pops up and says, oops, we can't show you this content for whatever reason. Hit Windows R and then hit Control V, and essentially what they're doing is trying to get you to copy paste something from your clipboard into the run, install the malware. But what this does is it actually steals anything entered into the browser. That's usernames, passwords, credit cards, all that kind of stuff, and sends it back to command and control infrastructure. Some of these are bot shops that are just really formalized credential log markets. And if you ever get a chance to see what those logs look like, they're quite interesting, but you can essentially scour through these and see what all the websites are that you'd be buying for the whopping price of $10 for somebody's entire username, password, and browsing history. But then those often come with the cookies that are stolen that I mentioned before that allow that replay. And that's how online banking accounts are being taken over. So consumer education is really important, but we also have to work hard to help our members help themselves. So conditional, situational based fraud mitigation tools like, challenging verification for new bill pay accounts, ACH, expiring sessions, obviously on logout, that's going to happen, but on, window close, that kind of thing. Anytime where something could be exfiltrating funds, you'd want to make sure that you're implementing additional controls with MFA challenges and things like that. Highly recommend that. There's obviously some more advanced things like, device fingerprinting and things like that that might be useful if you have that capability through your platform. But at a minimum, adding some of those additional controls, I do realize they introduce some friction in the customer experience, but I will say it will pay off in the long run from the fraud side.
Thanks, Brian. I know as a consumer, and I'm a customer of a local credit union here outside of Portland, and I love all the extra security they do, right? Like if they make me go extra step, I actually really appreciate
Sure.
it. Working in the industry, I'm a little more aware, maybe a little more conscious of but I'm like, yes, please give me every single alert, give me every single notification, as I think it gives me confidence that things are secure. Super interesting. A lot there to unpack. I'm curious a little bit on the credit union to vendor
Hmm.
threat landscape. I'm on the identity
Sure.
side. I know you mentioned you've seen this, this repeat attack over the
Hmm.
past 5 years. You'll talk a little more about that. I don't know if we covered that already in one
Yeah.
of your scenarios, but love a little bit more about that scenario.
Yeah, so essentially it's abusing trusted relationships, right? Wherever there's trust, right, there's a level of risk. And this is where those secondary controls that I mentioned are going to protect you. But essentially what we have is the attackers at some level are mapping out the relationships. And so because they, as part of their attacks, will scrape your inbox. I didn't mention that in my initial kind of overview, but let's say you've been compromised. Part of that is to download all your contacts, scrape all your contacts, right? And inside those are going to be obviously internal contacts. Some of them are going to be third party contacts at credit unions, but obviously some of them, depending on your role, are going to be vendors. And so then the vendor gets a message saying, "Oh, I know this organization," and they fall for the exact same attack. Then their contacts are scraped, and we go back in a circular pattern. So what you have in this case is, to an extent, vendors, industry partners who are part of this same phishing attack chain and the distribution attack chain. And when they fall for it, it's spread back to credit unions in these waves of phishing attacks, and eventually somebody clicks. Does that make sense? Kind of how that's
Yep.
working? Yeah.
Yep. Fascinating. Super helpful. Really cool. Anything else on the identity front? I know anything else that comes to mind that folks should know, or even some best practices you've seen, or yeah, any other thoughts there?
Definitely shoring up those conditional access policies, not just to block the code flow attacks, but again, look for something that is effective based on how your organization uses your Microsoft flows. It's not, again, it's not that there it can't happen with Google, some of the other ones. But if we talk about by percentage, it's mostly Microsoft credentials in this industry that are under attack through these phishing attacks that I'm talking about. So robust conditional access policies, you got to test them, make sure they work, right? Audit them if you're unsure, and put it in audit mode and get the reporting going. But definitely, if you can work towards hardware bound authentication, that is really, really critical. I didn't really mention why that blocks the aforementioned attack, but essentially it detects that there's that attacker infrastructure, that website that's not actually Microsoft, right in the middle of our legitimate user account and our legitimate Microsoft flow. It binds itself to login.microsoftonline.com, which is the typical enterprise login. And when it goes to authenticate and you don't know any better, you go to hit your YubiKey in this case, type in your PIN, and it goes, "Oh, I don't know this website. I'm not bound to that website. I can't complete the login." And that's why it blocks the attack. So really, really important. What I've said in some of the other talks that I've given is it's time for that paradigm shift. For those of you who've been in the industry a long time, you might remember whether it's member facing and, implementing two-factor authentication for the first time, or scaling that across the enterprise and people grumbling, "Oh, I got to get this PIN code and then type in my 6 digit. What's this all about?" It's kind of like enforcing complex passwords. You're going to get some grumbling, but eventually people will get used to it. And that's exactly what will happen with things like adopting FIDO2 and the YubiKeys, for example.
Cool. Love it. Thank you. Once again, folks, if you have questions, throw them in the chat or Q&A. We'll try to address them as we go through this conversation, and also towards the end. So I love, we'll circle back on AI, because I know you threw a bunch of ideas I'd love to go a little bit deeper on. Before then, I'd love for you just to share any thoughts on kind of the regulatory landscape, NCUA,
Mhm.
Any supervisory priorities for
Mhm.
2026 that you're hearing from your members? Yeah, any insights there?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, it's a carryover. Cybersecurity isn't like explicitly called out as on the main page of the supervisory priorities, but I think it's fair to say they're not going to not focus on cybersecurity. So if we go back to the prior year supervisory priorities and some of the best practices there, definitely working to make sure that the board is engaged in cybersecurity for starters, which is great because that also provides an opportunity that, depending on your organization, may be limited to security leaders on how often they get time in front of the board.
Mm.
Obviously, cyber governance is really, really critical. For me, I think because of that, and if we look at last year's supervisory priorities to start with, there was a push alongside a letter to credit unions from 2024 to educate the board and security leadership on key issues around information security, cyber threats. One thing that I can offer to your audience, if you don't already subscribe to this, you don't have to be a member for this. It's one of the couple things we do for non-members, is we do generate a monthly threats month in review report. If you email us at info@ncuisao.org, we can subscribe you to that and you'll get the latest copy. And then it comes out the first business day of every month. It's useful, not just to kind of keep yourself informed on everything that's gone on. It's such a big topic. There's so much information out there. Trying to pare that down to a one pager of the most important things. But also it's something that you can pass upstream to your leadership group, which I think is useful. So something, again, that I can kind of offer to support that effort of ongoing information security education. Put it in your board packet if you do a monthly packet. Keep yourself informed on the key issues as kind of we're tracking them, how we see them across the globe and within the credit union space. That said, it's very obvious in the 2026 supervisory priority that fraud and securing payment systems is really the hot topic, right? And that's where they're focusing on. Being honest, most of you are probably outsourcing a lot of that to the third parties or multiple third parties, just going to depend on which system that we're talking about. But there's probably several third parties in play. But that doesn't mean at the end of the day, you don't own the risk still, right? That's very, very clear that you can outsource the operational piece, some of the controls, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's still your vendor relationship, your member data for your financial institution and your responsibility to secure that. So, I'm glad to see that fraud is a focus, as I kind of led off with that narrative and some of the things that, again, unclear if it's driven solely by this year's supervisory priorities or just leading practice in general over time. But that convergence between the cyber and fraud teams, the White House cyber strategy also put onus on federal law enforcement to work harder and present an action plan that I think is probably due within the next 30 to 60 days on dismantling a lot of the global fraud infrastructure that's out there. So that's going to help in the long run. But at the end of the day, modern payment systems remain abused. They remain under attack. So it's critically important that you're asking good questions of your vendors, that you're understanding their risk, their controls, their ability to secure the systems in the same way that you would if you were building it in-house. And then, make sure that you're leveraging some of those efficient tools that they may have to detect fraud. Again, it's going to depend a little bit on what the system is and exactly where your battleship's focused, because all of that comes back to what I'm hearing, which is that credit unions in their exams, and I'll asterisk that depending on your examiner group, this may be something that kind of happens to you every year, but it's notable given the supervisory priorities this year that they've been expected to break out exactly what their fraud losses is for each type of fraud loss and then demonstrate what they're trying to do to mitigate that, what their controls are. And so it all goes back to that initial part of the due diligence, the conversation, establishing effective controls, because now you're being asked at a granular level in the exam process for that kind of detail around fraud. And so really, I think important. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think we all want to stop fraud and reduce fraud. It's a tangible line item at the end of the day, right? What are your fraud losses? In fact, most of you, if not all of you, are budgeting for some sort of percentage of fraud loss, right? And
Mm.
so wouldn't it be nice to reduce those and have more budget to freed up for other items?
Thanks, Brian. Super helpful. I put in the chat the email you mentioned, and I just emailed you all to get on the newsletter myself. So looking forward to receiving that. And it sounds like some of your members in the chat speak very highly of it. Folks, check that out.
Great.
I'm also going to put two other resources in the chat. One is we actually did a webinar with the NCUA last month with two RISOs, and we talked about a bunch of fun stuff. I learned a ton. We also have you can try it for free. It's a vendor security review tool, kind of tying in with that vendor security to kind of do a deep dive. And you can do some free vendor security reviews in our platform. So yeah, moving on to our next topics. Let's go back to AI. So in general, I know we covered a bunch of stuff. Obviously, acceptable use policy, the NCUA actually mentioned that. That was the one thing they mentioned that they're looking for as far as AI goes. I know they're still evolving, and RISOs and examiners have different expectation as it relates to AI. Acceptable use policy is definitely what they said you should have. Frameworks, it sounds like there's not a set framework, they're looking to, but, and I know there's some new, like the FI, AI, RMF framework. We're using the NIST framework a lot, but I'd love to hear from your side more on AI a little bit. Obviously, acceptable use policy, that's table stakes right now. Maybe on more the governance side, we could talk about the customer experience side and integrating AI more. But any other thoughts on like AI governance? What are you seeing folks do that makes sense? What are people like, hey, we've done these things. We're using this framework. We have a committee. Yeah, just curious what folks in your organization are sharing.
I think, well, it's a couple of things. Definitely AI committees, AI risk committees are extremely useful for establishing a measured, calculated approach to the adoption of AI. And I call this AI sprawl. It's something that I've, been warning about, but conceptually the whole thing is if you don't establish effective AI governance sooner rather than later, inevitably you're going to be adopting third-party based, maybe in-house AI-driven systems and then you're going to be trying to reel that back in. So imagine a future where you're behind on your adoption of effective AI governance in the first place. Again, controlled, calculated AI governance where you are auditing and monitoring what the systems do, where the data goes, what they have access to. And then you have, before that, 8 different systems are all using AI and pushing data up to third-party cloud. Now you're trying to reel all this back in, but it's like, oh, we use this all the time. It's a critical operational system. So I think it's really important to just take a step back and, do that calculated, measured approach, starting with an AI risk committee and engaging the board. There's a lot of really great tools out there. One underutilized resource that I'm going to say in general is the Cloud Security Alliance. They're a nonprofit organization. If you've never heard of CISO, they do initially a couple things like questionnaires on effectively asking questions, let's just say for due diligence as an example, for cloud-based controls. And then they have a certification system called STAR. STAR certification is where you can find major vendors have gone through a self-evaluation process, kind of like a PCI a little bit, and like have checked all these boxes, submitted their questionnaire, goes into a database out there. What I'm talking about here, though, is they're really working to advance the resources and tools around artificial intelligence as well. In fact, if you're doing anything with models in-house, which isn't a big percentage, it's very expensive to have an efficiently running AI model. If you're going to run one of the modern models with fantastic results, it's going to take an incredible amount of compute power and expense as a result. So we're not seeing a lot of that, but maybe about 10% of our credit unions, based on our fall survey we did last year, are hosting something in-house or at least dipping their toe in the water. There's a model safety called Risk Rubric with a K, I believe, .ai. It might be RIC, Rubric RIC at the end. It's one of those two, .ai, and that's actually got all the major models out there scored for safety, privacy, security. Are they susceptible in their testing to, model inversion and other types of prompt injection attacks, that kind of stuff. So there's more and more tools that are coming out with time to help with the AI governance side. There's also third parties out there. I know Userfront is a vendor that has changed their name. I'm sorry, I can't remember what their new name is. And I think maybe the same thing happened with Air AI, which stood for AI risk. Those are a couple of vendors that actually provide full-on solutions for logging, auditing, and then you essentially get like an approved portal where your members or your employees would then log in to use the various AI services that you've sanctioned. But because of that layer, that application layer is logging all of their use, limiting what files they can use, that kind of stuff. So I think that's definitely one of the key things that people are looking at from the AI side. Keep me on topic here, Taylor. I think I'm still in the frame of your question. Right.
Yeah, you're great.
Okay,
The
cool.
AI governance, I
Um,
think you're covering. This is great. Yeah. Anything else AI
Mhm.
governance
Yeah,
related or
one of the
risk?
concerns that's coming up is consumer privacy laws. Two things that I'll mention when you're looking at AI solutions, because we're in a really exciting time. Set the governance side of piece apart for a moment. You want to anchor it back to that, but we just look at like the cool things that the lifting that AI can do with heavy pieces of data, data sets, automation. It's really, really exciting. But don't forget, while the NCUA and the federal government's not going to knock on your door and tell you you can't use AI, you're still responsible for the outcomes. Okay. And whether it's an AI system or another information system entirely, you still have laws in place that you need to be mindful of. So that looks like consumer data privacy laws like CCPA, for example, forthcoming laws like Colorado's AI model bias for like autonomous decision making. So basically, what that means is if you deploy like an AI driven lending solution, there's certain things that have to happen. And don't forget about like metadata. So, one of the things that's kind of come up without naming names or anything like that is when you're using deepfake detection or voice biometric authentication, where does the metadata from that go? And when it
Mhm.
goes somewhere to be stored, in whatever state that is stored, is that a violation of any sort of consumer privacy law? These are tougher questions that you have to answer, but they go back, they're anchored in pre-existing laws or forthcoming laws, some focused on AI or otherwise. So you need to make sure that you're compliant with all the laws and you're not just asking questions about AI, that you're looking into whether or not it's going to be in violation of something that already exists out there, right? Data breach notification law would be a good example. Just because it was AI or not AI in any information system, the data breach is a data breach, right, under all those various conditions. So the same kind of consideration needs to be given to AI systems too.
Fascinating. I love it's super interesting. And I was talking with one of our internal consultants the other day, and she was telling me that because we're investing heavily in AI governance solutions and services, and actually doing a webinar in a couple weeks on the topic. And what she was telling me was that the shift, obviously, there is a compliance, right? But I think the shift is actually becoming much more legal. And so, and if you go look up, most of the conferences on AI governance or data governance, it's all lawyers, which I thought was fascinating, right? So I think it's definitely resonates with what we're seeing is that the legal and risk of lawsuits and all sorts of other fun things have will seem to increase, right? Those risks will seem to increase with
Sure.
the emergence of AI. Fantastic. Well, before we jump in, we have one kind of final section I'd love to hit. Ernesto was would love to learn a little bit more about NCU-ISAO and how it compares to the FS-ISAC.
Yeah, good question. It's probably one of the most common questions that we get. If you want the most thorough overview, I'm not going to lean on my members to describe the value because I know there's several of them in here. I'm not going to put that onus on you. If you want to learn the most about NCU ISAO and you can spare another 30 minutes with me, tolerate another 30 minutes with me, we do offer a monthly overview of membership and what all the benefits entail. And that can just be found at ncuisao.org/membership. That's probably the best way. We also have an on-demand recording if you're disciplined, and can say, hey, on demand, I'm actually going to sit down and give 30 minutes to this. But at the highest level, it's not an uncommon question. I think there's going to be some natural overlap. We are certainly focused and zeroed in on the credit union use case, how credit unions communicate, not just around threats, but additionally through key credit union topics of risk management, operations, regulatory compliance. Naturally, we can unite under a common language with the NCUA, though I know there's several state regulated credit unions, but still we're talking at the federal level about NCUA. But it's also about how we execute it. We work really hard to engage the wide range of stakeholders at your organization and also work to reduce the noise, right? By really rationalizing what's important now versus, what's important daily and what's important weekly. And part of that is really just to offer, again, intelligence at a clip that you can process. We know credit unions don't generally have a lot of staff on the information security side, but we also give you that opportunity with your membership to engage any stakeholders from VP of risk to CIO, CTO, whoever you really think it's relevant for. Also, we're probably focused more on the fraud side. And I only know what our members tell us. I don't have insight into how the FSISAC membership works truly, but it does appear that we are more focused on fraud stuff, including, maybe dark web and things like that too. So those are just some high level differentiators. But again, that's not really up to me to determine the value, up to you. And so we just try to give you as much information as you can to make a good informed decision. Some of our members are members of both and they find value that way too.
I've heard that as well. We have clients of ours that are members of both. So seems like they definitely get value from both organizations. So another question from Christopher. He asked, Brian, what were the sites you mentioned that provided solutions for AI logging and file
Yeah.
limitation?
A couple of the vendors, hang on, let me find out what Userfront changed their name to. I got a note from their CEO that they changed their name. Oh, yeah, they're called multimodal now. So multimodal, model.com is one. They used to be called Userfront. So if it seems familiar, that's what they are. And then AI risk. All right, let me see if I can find air. They have a tricky name. AI risk, air risk solutions. Nope. Ugh. I'm Googling this real fast.
You said modal AI.
Yep, and then that's Substack. Alex Alec with a C Crawford is the CEO of AI Risk, and I'm trying to find their name as I'm scrolling here. Verapath. They changed their name as well. I knew they did. So Verapath, Verapath, are a couple of those third-party solutions. The model safety that might be useful more for like an AI risk committee or something like that, or if you're playing around with OpenClaw, let's say in your environment, hopefully in an isolated environment, but in your environment, get some automations is Risk Rubric, RISK, RUBRIC.ai. And that's strictly a model safety, but Cloud Security Alliance or CSA, I think it's CSA Online, maybe is their website. That's a great resource beyond AI. Honestly, it's a great resource in general. I'm a big fan of open source information between CISA.gov and all the resources they have there to things like Cloud Security Alliance. There's so many things that have been created for you out there that you might be looking at from a risk management, governance, utility side that you don't need to always pay for stuff or bring in a vendor for it. So those are just a couple of my favorites.
Love that. The risk rubric looks really interesting. I'm definitely going to keep an eye on that because that sounds, I've not come across that. I'm looking at the different risk factors for the different models. Awesome. Well, we got about 10 minutes left here. Folks, if you have more questions, throw them in the chat. We'll try to hit them. We have one more section. I'm also going to throw in the chat too. We have two resources, free resources for folks. We have our AI governance workshop in 2 weeks, like I mentioned. Put that in the chat.
Sweet.
And then we also have an AI governance free assessment that goes through the NIST AI RMF. You can meet with one of our consultants, and they'll go through an assessment with you if you want to see how your AI governance maps to that framework. Cool. Last section is building reliance for 2027 and beyond. So, yeah, what's your top 3 to 5 recommendations? Like, if you had a short list of priorities, what would be your recommendations?
Well, it's pretty easy for me because I've already talked about most of this. So I'll summarize
Cool.
it, but I'll throw in another item or two as well, or expand on the AI piece. But first, identity-based attacks, shoring up the identity surface. It's not really when we look at how attackers are attacking, so to speak. I covered it in pretty good detail, and I would really focus on those areas of, again, shoring up conditional access for identity, adopting hardware-bound authentication. Another thing that we saw too that I think is, identity driven in the sense of account compromise is if you saw what the Handala hack group did against the medical technology company Stryker at the start of the U.S.-Israel-Iran war, that was a reminder, especially for Intune shops, to set up multi-admin approval. That is a feature that was specifically built into Intune for this exact reason. It's really easy. As long as you have admin groups established, if you're an Intune shop, you go in there, you set a couple policies, requires 2 administrators to go in separately to authorize device deletes, wipes, things like that. So shoring up kind of all those identity controls and surfaces is really, really important. Working to advance patch management cycles and consistently improve those. Our fall survey actually said the credit unions, at least the ones that responded to that survey, when it's a known exploited or critical vulnerability, they really do a good job. It's like 60, almost 70% of the respondents said that they patch critical or high severity known exploited vulnerabilities in less than a week. And about a third of those said that they do it in 48 hours or less, which is really awesome. This patching imperative, again, is something that we talk about a lot, and it's, I think, really, really important to improve upon and, see how you can do things better than maybe you currently are today. If again, that's where you want to prioritize things. Convergence of cyber and fraud teams. Again, it's just so much fraud's perpetuated through digital channels. It's really, really key. We talked about AI governance, but we didn't talk about agents. There's a really great blog that was shared to me on social media with one of our other partners I really latched onto it because I think it's a simple way at looking at how you deploy agents and what some of the basic guardrails should be. It's a blogger named Simon Willison, Willison, and he has a blog page called the Lethal Trifecta. And essentially what the lethal trifecta is, when deploying an autonomous decision-making AI, we call those agents, right? They're specific task-driven artificial intelligence agents. What you need to be mindful of is, does the agent have access to private data? Does it have access to the internet? And can it, if it does have access to the internet, can it seek and reach untrusted content? So untrusted content in this context, let's say, is the broad internet, right? There's many, many good websites on the internet. There's many, many bad websites. There's actually research coming out that there are legitimate traps set across the internet right now for agents that are crawling the web, trying to get them to, download malware, reverse engineer, prompt inject, all these kinds of different things. And so you need to be mindful that if you're going to have an agent that can reach untrusted content through the internet, then maybe it shouldn't have access to private data, right? So you just figure these three buckets. And if all three are the case, that's dangerous. So you should be trying to lop one of those off, right? So if it does have access to private data in the internet, then that content should be trusted that it's seeking, right? And so maybe it's connected into an information system through an API key, and you trust that system. It's an internal system. You're using the agent for data collection and gathering, but maybe you shouldn't have it be able to crawl the indexed web. So that's one good way to look at it. Additionally, whether it's for regulatory purposes or otherwise, agents should always have the ability for human intervention. Okay, so anytime an agent has some sort of decision-making authority, there should be some override controls and mechanisms. I've heard little things, even just like, hey, I've got an information gathering agent. Let me make sure I tell OpenClaw it's not allowed to create new accounts. It writes that into its memory, and then it won't go out and create new accounts. Or if you run into this roadblock, you need to tell me and stop what you're doing, and then it stops what it's doing. It notifies you, and then the human comes in and plays into it. So those are some things that I think it's really, really important, because while there's, theoretical levels of how agents evolve over time, it's kind of going to that Skynet thing, right? So I'm dating myself with the Terminator 2 reference, but you have fully autonomous AI out there right now. And so we have to make sure that we put guardrails in to control the ones that have access to our sensitive data. So really, really important for building cyber resilience and on. And I'll also raise my hand as the last item I have here. I am not an expert on quantum computing by any means, and I often kind of find myself thinking in circles, but we're asking ourselves, and maybe the board's asking you or leadership's asking you, what should we be doing? I did work with AI carefully to develop just a strategic planning strategy document. Ultimately, while a lot of this relies on big tech, the development of the hardware, we've got the development of post-quantum algorithms, right, that are secure against quantum computing. You can definitely take an inventory of your cryptographic assets and at least start by identifying the systems that are potentially at risk. That's kind of the square one. So I'll drop that in the chat if that's okay, Taylor. It's just a document that has some conceptual ideas on where organizations can start and what they can do today if they're a credit union versus just sitting there and waiting on big tech to tell them what to do.
Love that. I love to see it too. Thank you, Brian. I also threw that blog article. I found that blog article.
It looks like mine went straight to just the host and panelist, so you'll have to copy that and repaste it.
Oh, cool. I will do that. And yep, I put that blog article too that you mentioned. So thanks for sharing both of those resources. And it looks like a lot of folks got great value out of this conversation. Thanks again for coming on. We'll wrap it up there. And know we covered a lot of ground. So I'm going to rewatch the recording, and definitely, especially some of your identity talks were super interesting insights there. And what's the best way for folks to learn more about the NCU-ISAO?
Yeah, if you're new to it, we are, again, turning 10 years old, so we're really excited about our anniversary coming up here in about a month. But if you're new to the organization, new to the industry, you're not really sure about us, what we do, NCUISAO.org is our public-facing website. There's a membership tab, which kind of bullets out the various membership benefits. Also a link in there, as I mentioned before, to sign up for one of our member benefits briefings. You can either join one of the scheduled calls or request something on demand. That's the best way to learn more. But if you're looking for the more calculated approach and you want to take some time, let's start by signing up for that executive briefing, kind of see what we track, what we do, on behalf of the credit union industry, and also be on the lookout at the end of June for registration opportunity for our industry-wide virtual tabletop exercise. We get 500 to 600 people at that every August. This year's event is just at save the date status, and we're starting our panelists and planner meetings and all that good stuff. But it's going to be August 27th from noon to 4 p.m. Really great way to demonstrate how credit unions collaborate and share information in a live fire exercise and panel setting where the industry gets to come together and use chat like you are here in this session today, while also seeing some credit union industry stakeholders walk through the live incident response exercise that we developed for them.
Super cool, Brian. I love it. Yeah, I put your website in the chat, and I know a lot of our clients are members, and we really appreciate all the work you're doing, and really appreciate the partnership we have with you all. And I
Thank
know,
you for the opportunity.
yeah, thank you again for coming on. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you tuning in. We'll send out this recording afterwards. And thanks again, Brian, for coming on.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Take care.